Good evening, everyone. My name is Donna Murch, and as a member of Left Forum's Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event. Since its inception in 2005, the Left Forum has served as a crucial site for organizing and dialogue for leftists and radicals from all walks of life, multiple tendencies, and different registers. Tonight, we extend this forum to include legendary filmmaker Oliver Stone, and his co-author and collaborator, Peter Kuznick. In this time of retrenchment, privatization, of school closing, and cuts to all levels of publication in the US, alternative spaces for debate and discussion about our national past and present are absolutely critical. Tonight's dialogue between Bill Fletcher, Jr., former head of Trans-Africa, filmmaker Oliver Stone, and historian Peter Kuznick is a truly unique opportunity to talk about and reflect on issues of national memory, history, and US foreign policy, not only for people inside the United States, but throughout the world. I come to this event as a historian of the Black Panther Party and of radical black social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. One of the things that the Black Panther Party did that was remarkable was its ability to generate its own media and thereby to intervene in national debates about both repressive domestic and foreign policy of the US. And it is precisely this ability to not only generate ideas, but to capture the imaginations of large numbers of people and get them to rethink questions of our own shared past as citizens of the US that is the precondition for how to change the present. In thinking about the significance of Oliver Stone's The Untold History of the United States, I'm struck by its importance in doing precisely that. Film is a uniquely powerful medium for disseminating ideas and broadening the domain of what can be said. Indeed, it has the power to help change national memory. In the past and present, this has been used both for progressive and regressive political projects. For the latter, we might think of D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation. As America's first feature film, it played a crucial role in cementing and mobilizing national agreement on racial apartheid in the Jim Crow South. However, when nurtured in the right hands, Oliver, it becomes a powerful tool for social change, a liberating medium that provides access to an alternate history that many ordinary people would never have. Indeed, electronic media, and the documentary genre in particular, is one of our most powerful modes of political education. Personally, I was quite moved in reading about the inspiration behind the untold history of the United States when Oliver Stone spoke about the desire to help educate his own children about the truth of the American past. His artistic and political contribution is a profound one for both his own family and the larger national family by doing the work of changing the American narrative, not only for ourselves, but also for future generations. This has major, urgent political implications. To paraphrase a cherished inspiration of the Left Forum, the goal is not simply to interpret the world in various ways, but to change it. I would now like to shift gears and talk about the logistics of tonight's event. The program will run in the following order. First, we will watch some of the opening clips. Then Bill Fletcher Jr. will interview Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, and we'll have clips shown in between. And finally, we'll open it up to you, the audience, for Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce Bill Fletcher Jr. He is Okay, there is overflow rooms, there's room available in overflow rooms still, so, oh, or there's room down here. Oh, I get it, I'm sorry, the reverse. If you're in the overflow room, please come down. There's room down here. Oh, no, I know the order. Bill Fletcher is a longtime labor, racial justice, and international activist. He is an editorial board member and columnist for blackcommentator.com and a senior scholar for the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He is the immediate past and president of Trans-Africa Forum and a founder of the Black Radical Congress. Fletcher is the co-author with Fernando Gapacin of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice. And his most recent book is the very timely They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Bill Fletcher Jr. was formerly the vice president for the International Trade Union Development Programs of the George Meany Center of the AFL-CIO. And prior to this, he served as education director and later assistant to the president of the AFL-CIO. Fletcher got his start in movement building as a rank-and-file member of the Industrial Union of Marine and Shipbuilding of America. Combining labor and community work, he was also involved in ongoing efforts to desegregate the Boston building trades. He later served in leadership and staff positions in District 65, United Auto Workers, the National Postal Mail Handlers Union, and Service Employees International Union, SCIU. Fletcher is a graduate of Harvard University and has authored numerous articles and speaks widely on domestic and international topics, racial justice, and labor issues. Next, Greg Wilpert will introduce our two guests of honor, Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick. Greg Wilpert is a longtime Latin American solidarity activist and political sociologist who first got to know Oliver Stone through the 2010 film South of the Border, a documentary about Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez and other leftist leaders of Latin America. Greg became involved in the documentary because of his work on Venezuela, where he lived between 2000 and 2008. Subsequently, he published a book, Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, and launched the website venezuelaanalysis.com. By bringing together the Left Forum, Oliver Stone, and Peter Kuznick, he played a crucial role in making tonight's event possible.
Thank you, and welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to what I believe will be a fascinating conversation at this 2013 edition of the Left Forum. I'm especially excited about this evening's event because I've always been a great admirer of Oliver Stone's work, particularly ever since I saw one of his first feature films, Salvador, while I was in college, and involved in solidarity activism around with the popular movement of El Salvador, working to stop US intervention in that country's civil war. I subsequently followed Oliver Stone's work closely, and so it was a great honor to be asked to contribute to the 2010 documentary South of the Border, and to then participate in a panel with Stone at a screening of the film at the Angelica Film Center. Of course, in the course of this experience, Stone, the film's writers Tariq Ali and Mark Ricebrot, and myself were viciously attacked and unfairly attacked in the New York Times review of the film. I use the word review loosely because it was more like a piece of hate mail. Which is good, of course, because then we knew for sure that the film was doing something right. Be that as it may, Oliver ought to be more or less used to this kind of treatment by now because the mainstream media goes after him with great regularity, precisely because he is a daring political filmmaker who tackles subjects most others would never touch, all the while still maintaining box office appeal and impressive Hollywood credentials. He has won 3 Academy Awards, one for Best Adapted Screenplay, Midnight Express in 1979, and 2 Best Director Awards for Platoon in 1986 and Born on the 4th of July in 1989. More than that, he's regularly listed among the top 50 English-language film directors of all time, and is usually the only truly political filmmaker on these lists. By political filmmaker, I mean that he takes up controversial political subjects and historical topics and pushes us to think about these events in new ways, at least for those of us who haven't already made up their minds. But he is also a compelling storyteller and dramatist, and thus also someone who manages to get people interested in topics that they normally might not care about. Still, his films are not the typical Hollywood fare. Platoon, for example, depicted war, particularly the Vietnam War, in its crudest but also most realistic form, in a way that it had never before been presented up until then. Salvador, despite its relatively unappealing protagonist, shows the far greater ugliness of US involvement in that country. Stone's perhaps most controversial film up to now, and perhaps the most critical of the US power elite, was JFK, which exposed the obscure machinations that manipulate the US political system in favor of the country's ruling class. Even though Stone says that he's not an anti-capitalist, many of his films are certainly quite critical of capitalism, particularly JFK, Wall Street, and Any Given Sunday, which show how US capitalism is corrupting US culture and our psyche. An anti-capitalist such as myself might say that Stone's favoring of perhaps what one could call Jeffersonian capitalism, which is mainly opposed to savage capitalism, is a bit naive. Perhaps we have an opportunity tonight to change his mind on this issue. After all, the films Nixon and JFK stress the destructive nature of the role that the military-industrial complex plays in our society, and Stone's documentaries, particularly of Latin America's leftist leaders, show that he has respect for those who fight for anti-capitalist change. South of the Border and his 2004 film, Alexander, have something in common, though, something that I greatly appreciate, but which many leftist friends of mine see with suspicion, and which is the transformative power of bold leadership. I don't mean to compare these vastly different historical figures, but Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales, for example, do have bold leadership in common with Alexander the Great, I think. Stone's most recent effort to insert himself into the national discourse about the role of the United States and its history is the monumental 10-part series and book, The Untold History of the United States, which he wrote and directed together with historian Peter Kuznick, who we are privileged to have with us here tonight as well. Peter Kuznick is professor of history at American University and is the author and co-author of several books on the history of the nuclear bomb and the Cold War. As a New York native, he received his PhD from Rutgers University in 1984. He was active in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements and remains active in anti-war and nuclear abolition efforts. In 1995, he founded the American University's Nuclear Studies Institute, which he directs. And in 2003, Kuznick organized a group of scholars, writers, artists, clergy, and activists to protest the Smithsonian's celebratory display of the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. His current projects include a book on scientists and the Vietnam War and another one that looks at how the evolving understanding that nuclear war could lead to annihilation of life on the planet has shaped the behavior and views of military strategists, policymakers, and the public. Kuznick and Stone got to know each other in 1996 through a course that Kuznick teaches at American University called Oliver Stone's America. Untold History, of course, is just as Stone's other projects, does not shy away from controversy, and in the process presents a perspective on the US history that is radically different from one that most US Americans normally learn in high school. That is, this is a perspective that takes the plight of the victims of US history seriously and undermines US mythology about its past, precisely in the hope that a more honest approach to US history would help create a more positive and a more consciously democratic future. Hopefully, social studies classes around the United States will use this documentary from now on in their classes in school. But enough introductions. Let us get to the main event, where we'll learn more about this important project. I thus turn over the floor again to Donna Murch. Thank you.
So we're now going to look at some clips from the opening of the Untold History of the United States. Would you like to say some words about it? Okay, roll the clips.
Hello, I'm Oliver Stone. When I was a young boy growing up in New York City, I thought I received a good education. I studied history extensively, especially American history. It made sense. We were the center of the world. There was a manifest destiny. We were the good guys. Well, I've traveled the world now. I continued my education as an infantryman in Vietnam. I made a lot of movies, some of them about history. And I've learned a lot more than I once knew. And when I heard from my children what they were learning at school, I was perturbed to hear that they were not really getting a more honest view of the world than I did. We live much of our lives in a fog, all of us. But I would like my children to have access to something that looks beyond what I would call the tyranny of now. You watch the media, everyone talks about that thing, the news of the day, and all the subconscious, really important stuff that's going on is being neglected. Napoleon once said that history is a pack of lies agreed upon. Well, I'm not sure I agree. I believe history does have a meaning, does have a purpose, and there is a pattern to be found. And I wanted, with my colleagues, rather than make another feature film, to tell the American story in a way that has never been told before. There are many questions that you may not find answered here, but you will find questions raised that I hope will help make you more conscious. We are going to propose, among other things, a forgotten set of heroes. People who suffered for their beliefs and who have been lost to history because they did not conform. And we are going to debunk some of those heroes that you believe in, not with malice, but by restating the facts. Unless we remind ourselves of the good that we have lost, it's not easy to imagine a better future. By showing you the patterns of behavior which have come to be that you perhaps have not noticed before, we will try to bring you back to the meaning of this country and what so radically changed after World War II. There have been some profound mistakes, but we still have a chance, I strongly believe, to correct them.
Is this work?
Show the Oppenheimer clip. It's still coming up.
Is that coming?
The Oppenheimer.
Another clip we're going to show?
The Sangre de Cristo, or Blood of Christ, mountain range is one of the United States' most remote and primitive landscapes. In an isolated ranch house, the world's top scientists, many of them European, gather nervously in the chill morning air. Nearby in the darkness, something hangs atop a steel tower, a bomb. Today, they will test it. The test is codenamed Trinity. The inspiration, John Donne, Robert Oppenheimer's favorite poet. One of the premier scientists of his age, Oppenheimer loved literature in the desert of the Southwest. He was a peaceful man who just happened to have created and coordinated the most destructive weapon in all history. Only a few miles away, the project's military commander, Brigadier General Leslie Groves, is the man responsible for building the War Department's gigantic new headquarters in Virginia, known as the Pentagon. He doesn't like relying on unreliable civilian scientists. His career is on the line.
Here it is, General Groves, plutonium.
That's the first time I've seen it. But if you don't mind, I wish you'd hold that under it, because after all, there's about $50 million in that test tube.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert, and I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
In 40 seconds, we'll know.
In the last few minutes, general silence is observed as the countdown begins. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the bomb detonates. The light is brighter than the sun. Observing the explosion, Oppenheimer recalls a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita.
Now I am become death.
the destroyer of worlds.
This terrifying weapon would launch the United States on a journey, turning the refuge of the Founding Fathers into a militarized state.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. No, it's not. And you're all fired. Oliver, Peter, good evening. When I saw this documentary, I was sitting at home with my wife, and my mouth dropped. And I said, Candace, this is like on mainstream television? Am I missing something? And what inspired this? I mean, where did this documentary come from?
Should I go, Peter? Yeah, I was, I grew up conservative and I grew up Republican. My father was on Wall Street, and I went to Vietnam in the belief they were fighting communists. So I'm probably a little bit different from most of you. And Peter was protesting the nuclear bomb way back in the 50s probably, and then he was protesting the Vietnam War. So I reached a place in my life, to make a long story short, Greg Wilpert just summed it up very nicely, but when I did Salvador, when I went to Central America with Boyle in the 1980s, I was, let's say, I became progressively enlightened after my experience in Vietnam, but I was seeing Vietnam redux. I was seeing the same behavior, the desire to repress the poor, the reform candidates, the labor, teachers, nuns. It was Reagan's policy supporting the dictators there and the death squads that started to happen in Salvador and Honduras, and and Guatemala, of course, and the Contra War against Nicaragua. It was Vietnam redux, and I saw the whole thing, and I said, wow, I got to do something more in my life than make movies like Midnight Express and Scarface. So basically, I took another tack, and I did Salvador, which made very little money and very little, but it made some impact. And I found out that America's interest in Latin America is very minimal. Americans don't go to movies about it. That's just a fact, documentary or fiction. But I made it anyway, and I'm very happy with the result. Very proud of that film. But then I kept, thank you. We can talk more about Latin America later in your questions, but I kept trying to make progressive films, and I got more and more with Vietnam, Wall Street, JFK, Nixon. I got more and more research done in my life. I met more and more people, and obviously you evolve. So my life is really about evolution. And I reached this place when George Bush was in office for that second four-year term, when I was just had enough. It was up to here. I said, I can't go on making only movies, because I know too much now. I've seen too much in my lifetime. I grew up under the atomic bomb, the shadow of it, which is where I wanted to start this thing. So I wanted to go back with the remainder of time and energy that I had left and really do a documentary, because I've been accused endlessly of distorting the truth in my dramatic histories. So I wanted to go back and do it documentary style, with fact checks, which we did 3 of, and put it all down from 1900 to now. We actually have 12 hours, which was going to come out on DVD in October. But this is a story of the mask coming off. And this is the way I see it. And Peter sees it, because Peter and I had been friends since 1996. And he told me, I was very fascinated by the atomic bomb, the real story, because I'd always accepted the cop-out that the United States had to drop the bomb, that World War II ended triumphantly because we dropped the bomb, etc. So Peter told me this incredible story about not just the bomb, but the origins of that Henry Wallace story that seeds back to 1944. And you have to think about the possibilities if Wallace had been elected.
Peter, you have a different political history.
Yes.
How did you engage in this?
Well, my history is the opposite of Oliver's. I come from a New York Jewish left-wing family. I became very active in civil rights I joined the active civil rights movement when I was 12 years old. Became active in the Vietnam anti-war movement in high school. So I was an activist from the very beginning. And I never lost that activist edge. What I did is I turned it to some extent into my scholarship and into my teaching. So the ideas that Oliver and I are showing, I like to see this as a confluence between his work and my work. Because I see, when I decided in 1996 to teach a new course called Oliver Stone's America, I saw back at that point some of the kinds of messages that I wanted to emphasize in my teaching. When I could show that clip from JFK, the Donald Sutherland monologue there, that's brilliant. And that opened up for me a whole new understanding of documentary filmmaking, but also feature filmmaking, that Oliver could convey that much information, that much radical information in an enormously popular, successful movie like JFK. So it looked to me like that was a possibility that I hadn't reckoned with before. And then in films like Wall Street, you say that Oliver is not anti-capitalist in that sense, but the critique he has in Wall Street of American capitalism is really very profound. And it feeds into a lot of what the Occupy movement says, and a lot of what those of us who are democratic socialists believe about the economy. And I saw Oliver's films. Salvador does the same thing. These are radical critiques of American society. So even though Oliver says he wasn't there yet himself intellectually, he was clearly moving in that direction, as I was, because this is what I was teaching for 25 years. So I think that our ideas merged. And when in 1996, over dinner, after Oliver came to my class, I laid out this vision. I said, Oliver, this is an idea for a movie that you've got to make at some point. And I talked about how close Henry Wallace came to being back on the ticket as vice president, and what would have happened if Wallace, who's the most radical man ever to get close to the presidency, had become president in 1945 when Roosevelt died instead of Truman. That opened up all kinds of new vistas. And we weren't able to make the feature film back then, but we kept on talking about this over the years. We stayed friends. And then in 2007, we're having dinner in DC, and Oliver says, let's do it. Let's do a documentary. And at that point, we thought, at least for a few minutes, we were going to do one 60 or 90-minute documentary about Henry Wallace and the atomic bombing, the origins of the Cold War. By the time I went to see Oliver 2 weeks later in New York to map it out, Oliver said, no, let's do a 10-part, 10-hour documentary film series. So I was on sabbatical. I thought this was going to take maybe a year, and then it would be over. We worked on this almost nonstop for 5 years. And we ended up doing 12 episodes. When we released the box set in October, and Warner Brothers is going to do it at the least as inexpensively as possible, because we want a mass audience for this, we're going to show all 12 episodes in the box set, which includes our work that takes back to the late 19th century and goes through the origins of World War II, because that period is very important also. But most of this is going to start, as you see here, with World War II and with the atomic bomb. The first episode is really about World War II.
This was on Showtime. How did you pull that off? I mean, how were you able to convince them? I'm serious. How were you able to convince a mainstream?
Frankly, I don't know that it would ever have, no, it could never have been on network. There's no way. But as you know, network is all advertising, it's infomercials.
Right.
The Showtime is a premium cable. They had not done documentaries. They took this one, I really do think, on the power of my reputation, and they could get it at a price. We had financed it with private sources, and much of them from South America, some from the United States. But we had Showtime Advance, and then we had a Fremantle, which is an English sales company, Advance. So out of that, we pieced together an expensive documentary. It cost $5,200,000 approximately. And we still owe money. I mean, we're still getting the advances from around the world. But we are, you know, it was a pro bono kind of work. I don't advise it if you to everybody. I think, you know, I did make movies during that time, but I was always working on this in my spare time. So it was a miracle. They took it because the guy was a progressive, who was ahead. They had a change in administrations. A new man came in, and he supported it. They didn't do much advertising, let's be honest, but at least we got 1.1 million viewers a week on a premium cable, and that got a platform. We did not get reviewed well by the mainstream at all. We got excellent reviews in the progressive press, and some interesting notices in the right-wing press, but the center, very little interest.
I want to come back to that actually about the reviews in just a second. But what were some of the challenges that you faced, either with Showtime or just in general, in terms of putting this together?
A huge job. I mean, the archive, it's all archive footage except for film footage. There's no talking heads. Mm-hmm. So it's got to flow, and we only have 58 minutes to tell a decade pretty much. So it was the writing and the rewriting and the fact-checking. Oh my God. Even Peter was making mistakes, and we were catching him. There were so many, and then sometimes I'd be over, I'd get very poetic and over dramatic, and Peter would cut me back, and sometimes, he would go on about Reagan forever, and I'd say, let's cut that out. I think in chapter 2 we got carried away. We tried to make all the Poland happy. You can never make Poland happy, so we had a little bit too long on Poland. But it's that balance. It's a big picture. You got to have a big picture sensibility. You have to omit. There's so much great detail you have to omit. It's like writing a feature in 2 hours. You've just got to be very disciplined, and that took a lot of time and work. But the archive footage, by the way, comes from 5 different countries, and Rob Wilson did an amazing job of collecting it. It was a real guerrilla unit. We were not expensive. My model was World at War from BBC 1971. That was a great series about World War II, although it was anti-Soviet, but they had a great series. They did a great job. But they had a staff of 50. We had a staff of about 5 to 10 people at various times.
Before we see another clip, what struck me in looking at the whole series is that you seem to identify, or aim to identify, pivotal moments, which you see as pivotal moments, particularly since in the aftermath of World War II. And can you just say a little bit to the audience about what the two of you see as some of those pivotal moments and why?
Well, we also wrote a book that accompanied this, and we wrote an 800-page book, because one of the things that I was surprised to discover was how little you can actually say in 58 minutes and 30 seconds. The initial drafts that I gave Oliver were 2 to 3 times as long as what we finally were able to put on screen. So then we wrote a book with it. It ended up being 800 pages, but that's after we cut out 150 to 200 pages. So so just skimming the surface with this, so you have to choose the moments that are emblematic, that really capture what you're trying to say about the entire history. And so what are the key things about this period? World War II. What's the story about World War II? We wanted to focus on the myths. We wanted to show people the kind of crap that they were learning in the schools, especially at the universities, as Donna knows. We teach history one way. But in the public schools and on television, in the media, people get a very different picture. So we're trying to puncture those myths. So we start with the myth of World War II. You ask any American, who won World War II? Well, the United States did. What we show in this first episode is that it was not the United States that won the war in Europe. It was the Soviet Union that won the war in Europe. That, as Churchill says, the Soviets tore the guts out of the German army. That the Soviets lost 27 million in World War II. The United States lost about 310,000 in combat. Throughout most of the war, the United States and the British faced 10 German divisions combined. The Soviets were facing 200. So this is a history that Americans don't know. Then we go after that about the myths of World War II. We show the roots of World War II during the roots of the Cold War during World War II. Then our third episode is about the atomic bombing, because Oliver and I believe that so much of where the United States went wrong began with the atomic bombing in 1945. Not only was it militarily unnecessary or unjustifiable and morally reprehensible, it gave the United States the idea that we could force our will upon the world. Then the building up of the American empire. And then we show the Cold War in the earliest period. And then we show the Eisenhower period, because the myth about Eisenhower, if you ask people what they know about Eisenhower, they'll say the military-industrial complex speech. Nonsense. That's not who Eisenhower was. Eisenhower was the person who built the military-industrial complex, as we can discuss later. So I don't want to tell the whole story, but We chose the moments that we thought were both the most clouded in mythology and that were the most central to the building of the American empire, because our goal was to tell the history of the American empire and the history of the national security state from the late 19th century to Obama yesterday.
I would just quickly add, because we're not going to show a clip from Eisenhower. We're going to go ahead to the later era, Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy, the end of Kennedy and the beginning of Johnson. But just because it'll come back up, under Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, it's fascinating to see how the United States becomes a force for repression of all reform. It starts not with Reagan in Central America. It starts with Eisenhower, with Iran, with Guatemala, with Cuba, with Angola, everything, all the machinations. To John Foster Dulles, neutralism was immoral. That was his famous quote. Communism was evil. He said that before Reagan. And his idea, and Eisenhower fully supported him, was to roll back communism everywhere. Indonesia becomes one of the bloodiest stories of that era, or it starts in that era. So it was a devastatingly evil policy that Eisenhower, who's such a nice guy and a grandfather figure to so many people, and was to me and to my father, did so much bad in the world in the name of fighting communism. But as we tried to show it wasn't communism, it was reform. It was the poor, the desires of the poor, the oppressed, to be free in their own countries. That was what we were against. Eisenhower was solidly in favor of corporate capitalism, and I use the word capitalism with full knowledge of what it was, exploiting the resources of these poor countries and undermining any government that wanted any kind of reform or fair shake.
Should we look at another clip? If you're ready for it. Yeah, why don't we do another clip? Okay.
On to this next clip, which is we have to go in the beginning of chapter 7. Why don't we just start it, and they know they're
funded by the conservative billionaire Koch brothers.
The confused American public, not knowing who to blame for persisting economic hardship, handed the Republicans a sweeping victory in 2010.
And we were doing so well.
We'll get back to that clip later, because we wanted to show a little bit about Obama.
By the tens of thousands, until the communists threw up their wall of hate.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected.
While we're waiting for this, I actually want to turn a question to Peter. Peter, the Henry Wallace issue, which is early on and actually runs through the beginning, where the documentary asserts a different kind of path could have been followed by the United States. And it didn't happen. And in 1948, Henry Wallace runs for presidency. What happened? What blocked him? And why did he choose to run as an independent at that time?
Does everybody here know who Henry Wallace is? No? I get yeses and nos. Henry Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture during the New Deal. In 1940, when Roosevelt was running for a third term.
I'm sorry, it's coming now.
Okay.
I got it up. Okay. Let's play it up.
Hold that point.
Volume.
Let us never fear to negotiate.
East Germans escaped by the tens of thousands until the communists threw up their wall of hate.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
This generation of Americans has already had enough, and hate and oppression.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems, but they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia, and why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Two days into office, on the Sunday, the day before John Kennedy was buried, Lyndon Johnson met with his military advisors and said he was not going to lose Vietnam. He never agreed with Kennedy's memorandum to withdraw, and 2 days later he issued a new memo signaling the U.S. would be taking a more hands-on approach. His foreign policy thinking was profound in a primitive way.
There are 3 billion people in the world, and we only have 200 million of them. We're outnumbered 15 to 1. Might did make right. They'd sweep over the United States and take what we have. We have what they want.
It was they. His analogies may have been coarse, but stated in other words, the struggle was not really about communism, but was between the First World and the Third World. Abandoning Kennedy's attempts at reform, Johnson made it clear in the new Man Doctrine that all Latin American countries would be judged on how they protected the $9 billion in U.S. investments, not on the interests of their own people. The U.S. would no longer discriminate against right-wing dictatorships and regarded military aid as a wiser investment than Kennedy's economic aid. The fifth largest country in the world, resource-rich Brazil, would be the first to suffer. In 1964, new democratically elected President João Goulart implemented land reform and sought controls on foreign capital. Recognizing Cuba was the last nail in his coffin. Castro's example could not be emulated.
Thank you. Let's hold on the Henry Wallace discussion. I want to actually go back prior to the events that are covered here on this particular clip. Because the scariest episode for me was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one of the things that you convey is that there have been several moments when we've been on the verge of nuclear war. And I can remember as a kid the fear that I felt at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was very young, but the fear was everywhere. There are moments in there that you discuss, and I would appreciate it if you could take us through what exactly happened. What is it that most people do not understand about the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The Cuban Missile Crisis, what people have a sense how close we came to actual war, but they don't really know the details of it, which we've been finding out lately from some of the documents that have been released. And the scariest moment, which Schlesinger said was not only the scariest moment of this crisis, but the scariest moment in all human history, was when U.S. ships were dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine that was approaching the blockade line, and the power went out in the Soviet submarine. The carbon dioxide was rising. The sailors were fainting. The officers were fainting, passing out. The chief officer says, the war must have started already. We're down here doing somersaults. We should launch our nuclear torpedo. The Americans had no idea that they had nuclear weapons on this submarine that we were knocking out down there. So they gave the order to launch. Fortunately, the sub-commander talked him out of launching. Had he not talked him out of launching, then, and his name was Arkhipov, this man named Arkhipov, who was unknown to history, single-handedly prevented nuclear war from starting that day. Had they launched, the United States would have retaliated with nuclear weapons, and much of the world as we know it probably wouldn't be here now. So that was about the scariest moment, but that was not known to the public. Even what was known to the public, the pressure on Kennedy to invade Cuba was enormous. The entirety of his Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing him to do it. All of his advisors were pushing him to do it. Even people like Sorensen and Robert at one point were encouraging a U.S. surgical strike followed by an invasion. Had we done that, we were completely ignorant of what was going on there. We didn't know that the weapons were there, that they were installed, that they were ready to launch. We didn't know where they were. We didn't know how many there were. And what we really didn't know was that there were battlefield nuclear weapons, 100 battlefield nuclear weapons also. Initially, McNamara said we would lose maybe 1,800 people. Then when he found out some more of the details, that there were 3 times as many armed Cubans and 4 times as many armed Russian Soviet soldiers there, then he said we would have lost 25,000 people in an invasion. When he found out that they had 100 battlefield nuclear weapons, McNamara almost passed out 20 years later, 30 years later. And he says, if we had invaded, we would have lost 100,000 men. We would have wiped out Cuba and very likely the Soviet Union also. And so that's how close we came. We were acting out of ignorance, as we often do in these situations. And what Kennedy and Khrushchev both learned from this is that these kind of crises cannot be controlled. Even though both of them were doing everything they could to avoid confrontation and war there, they both concluded that there was no way to control a crisis like this. So Khrushchev contacts Kennedy and says, we have to eliminate every possible conflict that can lead to another confrontation like this. And Kennedy and Khrushchev, from 1962, late 1962, through Kennedy's assassination, did everything they could both to roll back on all of these crises and to end the Cold War. So our interpretation of Kennedy in the last year is very different than the Kennedy who in the 1950s as a senator and the Kennedy the first 2 years of his administration when he remained a Cold War hawk. But Kennedy learned something that most American presidents, like Barack Obama, have not learned. How dangerous this situation is and the folly of this kind of confrontation when you've got people armed to the teeth in this kind of world.
Oliver, go ahead.
Peter forgot to add one name to that list that was advising him to go into Cuba. That was Dwight Eisenhower, who was the much revered ex-president of the United States. I think Kennedy deserves a little more credit from 1960 on because he did not invade at the Bay of Pigs. He was supposed to support the invasion. That was the unwritten policy of the United States. Eisenhower would have supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy did not send the support. That caution was the beginning of, was the strength of his character. And he also must give him credit for not going into Laos. Eisenhower advised him to take a stand in Laos. He said no. And he pissed off the military. And by the time of 1962, when there had been this Operation Mongoose, and the military really thought they were going to invade Cuba. There were 3 military exercises against Cuba. Large military exercises with takeovers of Caribbean nations. One of them was called Ortsak, which is Castro spelled backwards. So it wasn't that hidden. And the Soviets knew about it. And the Cubans certainly knew about it. So, you know, the whole concept of even 1962, Kennedy is resisting this invasion. And that's what leads to the missile crisis. Now, I know Mr. Chomsky wouldn't agree with our view of Kennedy, and I don't agree with his. But, you know, he seems to think that Kennedy is responsible. But who could have stopped this war machine that had been built up in those insane years from 1945 to 1960? Who could have stopped it? How could you become president in an environment like that when we're really primed for war? And Eisenhower left a system on which all the Dr. Strangelove scenario could have happened. He had all the right to launch was divided among the commanders and sub-commanders in some cases. So it was an insane environment. You can't put a stop to a horse that's out of control. But Kennedy had the strength of character and the courage. He was a military man, and he served heroically in World War II in the Pacific. He realized, I think, pretty soon, after he met Lemnitzer and some of the other people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that they were dopes. And he said so to I believe, Schlesinger. So, you know, I think Kennedy, in the larger story here, the bigger pattern is that the reason we showed the clip is that there is a significant difference between John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, a significant difference. And the whole march, in a few days, you saw it. I mean, Johnson immediately closes down in Latin America, immediately makes his point clear in Vietnam, and of course against Cuba. And any further dialogue to end this Cold War with Khrushchev is out. Khrushchev is himself removed by the hardliners in Russia the next year. So the whole world tilts again. The larger point being that the same thing happened with Wallace and Truman in '45. Devastatingly tragic moment, and it will happen again and again. There's a great moment in 1953 when Stalin dies, and the new Soviet leadership offers peace feelers, serious peace feelers to Eisenhower, who was a new president. Dulles and Eisenhower turned them down. It'll happen again and again. The curve of the ball will break differently. History has shown us that. And it happens, but that gives me hope. It may be sad, yes, we lost those opportunities. Gorbachev comes along and offers these great opportunities in the 80s, 86, and then again with Bush in the Bush Senior in 89. Bush blows it, man. He really blows it. It's an ugly story. We should get into it later. But these opportunities will come again, and that's what gives me hope.
Let me just ask one follow-up. The sense in watching the documentary is that a significant section of the military actually believed that they could win a nuclear war. Is that your conclusion?
Well, we know that's the case up to a certain point. Not only did they know they could win a nuclear war, because we had intelligence. Mm-hmm. That's why when the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, Eisenhower wasn't fazed at all. He went out and played 5 rounds of golf that week to show that he wasn't at all upset by that. Most Americans thought, well, that means they can launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, and we're vulnerable. Eisenhower knew that wasn't true because of the U-2 flights, which were top secret, so he couldn't tell why he knew that that wasn't true. But he knew that the Soviets were behind us in every way. Kennedy didn't know that. Kennedy ran on the basis of the missile gap. Kennedy said, Eisenhower has let us down, and we're behind the Soviets in all these ways. Kennedy immediately got Roswell Gilpatrick to do a study for McNamara of what the real nature was of our weaponry versus the Soviet weaponry. And we immediately discovered that there was a missile gap, but it was in our favor. And then they continued to study, and they found out that we were ahead by 2 to 1 in some categories, but in most categories, we were ahead 10 to 1, including in intercontinental ballistic missiles. But because we had created this idea of a missile gap, there was pressure on the Kennedy administration to increase the number of our missiles. They finally settled on increasing by 1,000 the number of our intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you're sitting in the Kremlin. You know the Americans are already ahead 10 to 1 in weaponry at that point, and you see that the Americans are going to double what they already have. What did that mean to the leaders in the Kremlin? That meant to them that the United States were preparing for a first strike to wipe out the Soviet Union. That's why, a big part of why they put those missiles into Cuba, for 2 reasons. One was to offset the American advantage in terms of the real missile gap, and the other was to protect Castro because they knew that they knew that the United States was about to invade Cuba, which they were. And so Khrushchev gambled. And it's the same scenario as in Dr. Strangelove, as we show, where But he made one mistake, and it's the same mistake that they make in Dr. Strangelove. He didn't announce that the missiles were there. Had Khrushchev announced that the missiles were there and that the battlefield nuclear weapons were there, not only could the United States have no longer invaded Cuba, but could no longer have attacked Cuba either. But he didn't announce it. They were waiting for November 7th for the anniversary of the Russian Revolution as a big surprise announcement. And it's in the middle of that that the United States sees the missiles in Cuba and the whole crisis evolves.
I want to jump, before we see, I think, the final clip, I want to jump to this issue of some of your critics. I mean, there's many, many more things that I'd love to cover about the documentary. But I was reading some of the criticisms, and harsh is an understatement. You have been vilified by liberals. I mean, I expected the ultra-right, but there's a whole segment of the liberal community that has attacked the documentary and the book. And by the way, if you this book is really a tremendous book. When I read it, as a history buff, I thought I'd go through it very quickly, and I just kept finding amazing facts, incredibly well written. These attacks, they range from that this is an unpatriotic documentary. There are challenges to you on the facts that were indicated in some of these. Oliver, you mentioned in the beginning that there was fact-checking. One of the things that I came across was suggesting that quotes weren't used properly. So one of the quotes that was mentioned was some senator who said that, if the Russians looked like they were getting ready to lose World War II, they'd support the Russians. If the Germans looked like they were ready to lose, we should support the Germans. And they said that you didn't properly put the entire quote in there. So I'm just wondering, how have you responded to these kinds of criticisms?
Well, the senator you're mentioning was a senator named Harry Truman, senator from Missouri, who said that.
I've heard of him, actually.
Yeah.
But, well, go ahead.
What's the issue? Context.
I mean, that's what he said. I don't know what the issue of the context.
What it says at the end is that, but under no conditions should the Germans be allowed to win, right? And so...
and his point was, let's kill off as many Russians and as many Germans as possible. Mm-hmm. That's what Truman said.
Yeah, I mean,
so we use that because we want to show that Truman's anti-Sovietism was deeply ingrained by the time he becomes president. Truman vacillated in the first year a little bit about whether or not the Soviets could be friends or enemies because Wallace was Secretary of Commerce and was in his ear constantly telling him, don't make enemies of the Soviet Union. Look at the world through the Soviet eyes. Look at the world the way it looks to them, and then you'll empathize with their situation. And Truman did listen to that, but he finally takes the advice of Harriman and Jimmy Burns and Forrestal and the hardline Cold Warriors rather than that. And the British are very important in that regard. And Anthony Eden later was very critical of Truman, saying that he broke so completely with Roosevelt's policies. But the issue you're raising is an interesting one to us because we also anticipated getting slammed by the right-wingers, which we have, and we expect to be. But there was another kind of attack, and those were from the Cold War liberals. Now, the Cold War, the main person was a historian named Sean Wilentz. Sean Wilentz wrote a book called The Age of Reagan. In that, he has 167 pages on Ronald Reagan. Of those 167 pages, he's got 2 pages that deal with Reagan's atrocities in Central America. We have 41 pages on Reagan in our book. We have 8 pages of Reagan's atrocities in Central America. He neglects to mention the genocide in Guatemala. I mean, for us, the heart of Reagan's policies was the cruelty, the brutality, the massacres, the genocide, supporting right-wing governments, overthrowing left-wing governments in Central America, as well as the stupidity of his involvement in Afghanistan and building up the Mujahideen and these fanatics who later blow back on us.
And Iran.
And Iran. So that's a very different perspective. But who was Sean Wilentz? He's a good historian of 19th century America. He wrote a good book about Jackson. But he doesn't understand this period very well, and he's a very strong supporter of Hillary Clinton. Now, Oliver and I are very big critics of Hillary Clinton. We think Hillary Clinton was one of the hawks who helped push Obama to the right as soon as she was in this administration. That she supported the invasion of Iraq. She supported the invasion of Libya. She was one of the people who refused to give Obama any options on Afghanistan and pushed him to triple the number of US troops in Afghanistan. When you look at her comments about the world and history, that same idea of American exceptionalism, which we take a lot of exception to American exceptionalism. She pushes this idea and says it on a number of occasions that the same as Madeleine Albright. When Madeleine Albright said, if we have to use force, it's because we're the United States of America. We're the indispensable nation. We stand taller and see farther than other countries. Hillary Clinton says the same thing. Obama has said the same thing also. This is a motif that runs throughout a certain view of America's role in the world, and we're very critical of that. And Sean Wilentz is a big backer of hers. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's the reason why he went after us so viciously, but he's also a Cold War liberal. And who are these Cold War liberals? Those are the people like Harry Truman, who supported McCarthyism. Those are the people who supported US interventions around the world. Those are the people who supported the war in Vietnam. That was not a Republican policy, that was a Democratic policy, much more so. And these are the people who now are creating the United Stasi of America. These are the people who are behind so much of the surveillance state, the police state, that's being built up in the United States now. So yes, we have this certain wing of liberals who don't like what we're saying, and if you read our book and you watch the whole documentaries, you'll understand why they don't like what we're saying.
Well, let me push you on this. Stalin. One of the criticisms that is recurring is that you allegedly paint Stalin as fairly rational. You undermine, or not undermine, underplay the purges and what happened after World War II. What is your sense? What happened? And I remember in the documentary that when Stalin finds out that Roosevelt had passed, that he was very upset. That he had thought that Roosevelt was a good partner, but the attacks on you regarding this, that you really underplay Stalin and the kind of character that he was.
I don't know if I can read this. It's a little small for me, but it's a great statement by Avril Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who's one of the key proponents of the Cold War. And he says, it's hard for me to reconcile the courtesy and consideration that Stalin showed me personally with the ghastly cruelty of his wholesale liquidations. Others who did not know him personally see only the tyrant in Stalin. I saw the other side as well. The high intelligence, that fantastic grasp of detail, his shrewdness, his surprising human sensitivity that he was capable of showing. I found him better informed than Roosevelt, more realistic than Churchill, in some ways the most effective of the war leaders. For me, Stalin remains the most inscrutable and contradictory character I have ever known. That was Avril Harriman. What we do with Stalin here is we are very critical of Stalin. We are in some ways more critical than the right-wingers are, not only because of Stalin's crimes and atrocities in the Soviet Union, but because the Soviet Union has been an albatross around the necks of the left throughout the 20th century because of Stalin's crimes. So to those of us who are on the left, Stalin is even more anathema because of what he did to destroy the reputation of socialism. We don't pull our punches. What we do is we give Stalin credit for having won the war in Europe during World War II. We show that as the Cold War was unfolding, the United States was the one who was initiating all of the worst things. Stalin's policy initially was not to create repressive Soviet-style dictatorships in Eastern Europe. Stalin's policy was to have friendly governments in Eastern Europe. It's not really till 47, 48, 2 years into or 3 years into the Cold War that he puts these repressive governments in place. He knew this wasn't realistic. He said, socialism fits Poland like a saddle fits a cow. And in fact, if he had really been aggressive, he could have had revolutions in France after the war, in Italy after the war, in China after the war. As Churchill says, we made an agreement, Stalin and me, and I gave him Bulgaria and Romania, and he gave me Greece. And he never broke his promise to me. He always stuck to what he said. So Stalin, during this period, wanted to maintain friendly relations with the United States, partly because he wanted the reparations that we had promised, talking about $20 billion reparations figure, half of which would go to the Soviets. He desperately needed that to rebuild. The Soviet Union was devastated by World War II. Kennedy later says it's as if the entire United States east of Chicago had been wiped out, what the Soviets suffered. And so he wanted to rebuild his country, and he wanted to have friendly relations with the United States. We go after that, but that's not the center of our story. We talk about Stalin's atrocities, but that's not the center of our story. The center of our story is the history of the American empire. But if you see that and you watch all of our episodes, there's no way to say that we were sympathetic to Stalin. In fact, we're harshly critical of Stalin.
Do you want to look at the final?
No,
okay.
Partly Peter's referring to episodes, prologue A and B, which are coming out in the 12th set, because that is pre-World War II. We deal with the communism versus capitalism argument. We go back to the origins of the Russian Revolution and World War I, which is a mother of World War II, and how the United States invades as part of the 18 foreign armies, I think, went into Russia, in Siberia. And in the 1918, Woodrow Wilson sent troops to Russia. Mm-hmm. So the Russians from the beginning, viewed us as a capitalistic aggressor. And it was only Roosevelt established relations with the Soviet Union in 1933 only. Mm-hmm. So we had Roosevelt had a real alliance, a real partnership, the Grand Alliance it was called. And that's what we should mourn, because it disappeared in about 2 weeks after World War II. It's amazing how quick it goes. If Roosevelt had lived 3 more months, the whole world would be in different shape. If Wallace had become president in April '45, the whole world would be different. It's amazing how the curve of the ball breaks sometimes. But that was pure bad luck the way he died so quickly.
Before we see this last clip, I want to ask you, I want to pursue this point that you're just making, Oliver, because at different points you do highlight the role of certain individuals, Roosevelt, Wallace, etc. But my question is, are you putting too much on these individuals? I mean, in other words, I think that the record is fairly clear in terms of Wallace, what Henry Wallace stood for, but there are other factors that are at play when these individuals get into office. And had Wallace been elected president or taken over as vice president or been elected in '48, why should we believe that things would have fundamentally changed? I mean, what I wondered in watching this is one vicious country. This is a vicious country. And we know that in the 1930s, there was a plot to overthrow Roosevelt, trying to enlist Smedley Butler and veterans. It seems to me that in the middle of the Cold War, something very similar could have happened. So, but in any case, I mean, what is it that leads you to believe that these individuals would ultimately have made that much of a difference in terms of where we ended up?
Well, there's no way to know. You know, we can't say for sure what would have happened had Wallace become president instead of Truman. As we show, Wallace came extraordinarily close to getting to be back on the ticket as vice president in 1944. In fact, he was the second most popular man in America. Even though he called for the century of the common man, he called for worldwide people's revolution. He denounced America's fascists, who he said were those Wall Street interests who think Wall Street comes first and the American people come second. Now we call them Democrats and Republicans. He had a very radical vision, but he was enormously popular because the country was more progressive then. we were fighting a war against fascism and German and Japanese militarism. Gallup released a poll on July 20th, 1944, the start of the Democratic Convention, that asked potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Henry Wallace as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. But the convention was stacked. But Wallace gave the seconding speech for Roosevelt that opening night. The place went wild, even though the party bosses thought they had it controlled. 45-minute demonstration led by people like Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson. And in the middle of that, Claude Pepper, the senator from Florida, nicknamed Red Pepper because of his politics, he makes his way up to the microphone, knowing if he could get Wallace's name in nomination that night, he'll sweep the convention and be back on the ticket as vice president. Pepper got literally 5 feet from the microphone when the bosses managed to adjourn the convention that night. And so that's how close we came. Had Wallace gotten in there, he could have stopped the atomic bombing. He could have done that on his own authority, and we know that he would have done that, or we know as much as we can know anything. Could he have stopped the Cold War? That's a different question. As you're saying, there are structural forces in place. But 1945 was not like today. 1945, we were a much more progressive country. 1945, the Soviets were our allies. They were lionized for having just won World War II. They were the reason why the British weren't speaking German was because of the Soviet Union. And people understood that at that point. So I think he could have certainly resisted the kind of Cold War we had and very likely changed it. Kennedy's another example. What could Kennedy have accomplished in 1963? He says in his American University speech, his commencement address, he says, we want to end the Cold War. You know, he talks about a one-world vision. He's seeing the world like Wallace saw the world through Soviet eyes. Kennedy was doing the same thing. There were forces that resisted that. You know, we don't know for sure who's responsible for assassinating Kennedy, but it's a lot of those same forces who managed to bring Wallace down in 44 and 45 and 48, who were also very likely behind the assassination of Kennedy at that point. But you have to mobilize the masses behind these ideas, which is what you need to do. You need a president who's going to be an educator, and you need mass forces that are going to force the president in the right direction. Obama has said at one point, said, if you want me to do the right thing, you're going to have to force me to do it. Obviously, we haven't forced him to do it. So you need both. You need a grassroots movement. You need a politicized, conscious, organized citizenry. You need a strong labor movement. We had a strong labor movement then, as you know, which we don't have now, despite your efforts. And I mean, all of that is necessary in order to force these people to do the right thing. But at least at some points, you've got presidents who want to do the right thing and are trying to do the right thing.
So maybe we should use that as a cue for the final clip.
We thought we'd move ahead into, since you mentioned Obama, and show you, this is a vast, this last chapter it's called Bush and Obama, the Age of Terror. So there's a lot here, a lot of information. We're just going to show you a 10-minute clip in the middle when Obama first comes to power, and we're not going to go into the economics right now. There's a Wall Street section. It's right after the Wall Street section. We're going to go into his promises about the surveillance state, et cetera. Okay, I hope she hits it this time. Yeah, it looks like it. Go ahead.
Funded by the conservative billionaire Koch brothers. The confused American public, not knowing who to blame for persisting economic hardship, handed the Republicans a sweeping victory in 2010's midterm elections. But only more gridlock and confusion pervaded Washington. Obama, who'd swept to office amid such euphoria, now walked a fine line, avoiding fatal mistakes, but failing to deliver on hope or change. During the 2008 campaign, the constitutional professor had promised transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency. Yet, in office, he refused to relinquish the expanded powers usurped by the Bush administration. As a passive population continued to consent to being stripped in front of airport screeners, permit eavesdropping on their communications, and pay for vast new security programs. It did not make political sense for Obama to ease this heightened state of alert in the risk that a single terrorist incident would certainly result in renewed media hysteria and a Republican "I told you so" firestorm that could cost him his presidency.
ever in the middle of all this coming at you think maybe one term is enough?
The one thing I'm clear about is that I'd rather be a really good one-term president than a mediocre two-term president.
Instead of fighting for transparency, however, Obama became a far more effective manager of the national security state. Like Bush, he repeatedly invoked the state secrets privilege in lawsuits involving torture, extraordinary rendition, and illegal NSA eavesdropping. He blocked habeas corpus rights for enemy combatants, preserved military commissions, and authorized without due process the killing of a U.S. citizen in Yemen accused of having ties to al-Qaeda. Obama stunned civil libertarians when he took Bush-era investigations to the next level and began prosecuting government whistleblowers and reporters using the World War I-era Espionage Act. Only 3 cases had been brought in 92 years. Obama initiated 6 cases of dubious merit, most defendants claiming to have exposed unlawful activity in the government. Most prominent was Bradley Manning, an Army intelligence analyst in Iraq who leaked over 260,000 classified diplomatic cables and war reports, as well as videos, distributed by WikiLeaks, a non-profit whistleblower media organization. These revelations of U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and U.S. support for dictatorial regimes in the region proved to be a significant catalyst for the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, and Bahrain. Nonetheless, Obama's administration has severely impaired the operation of WikiLeaks and threatens to prosecute its co-founder. These actions send a clear message to all whistleblowers. Commit war crimes like Bush and Cheney, and you walk free. Expose them, and you risk careers and huge fines. Or, like Manning, you rot in jail. One of the leading defenders of the new standards of conduct, Jack Goldsmith, former head of the Bush Office of Legal Counsel, reassured Cheney and other anxious neocons in an article saying that Obama was
like Nixon going to China. The changes he had made are destined to fortify the bulk of the Bush program for the long run.
This was a new shadow world. In 2010, the Washington Post called it an alternative geography of the United States, a top-secret America hidden from public view. Almost 1.5 million people had top-security clearances. More than 3,000 government and private security corporations existed. 1.7 billion emails and communications were intercepted and stored every day by the National Security Agency. Political commentator and constitutional lawyer Glenn Greenwald best described this truly radical change in our world when he wrote, "The core guarantee of Western justice since the Magna Carta was codified in the U.S. by the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." He might well have added the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the right to privacy and protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Without due process and the right to privacy, each of us is essentially living at the mercy of the surveillance state. All this in the name of stopping a terrorist threat blown wildly out of proportion. Obama's foreign policy seemed more reasonable than Bush's, repudiating the unilateralism and preemption that had so outraged world opinion. But the goal, embracing U.S. global domination, differed little, and even the means were frustratingly similar. In 2011, Bush's former NSA and CIA director, General Michael Hayden, took comfort in the powerful continuity between 2 vastly different presidents, saying that
Americans have found a comfortable center line in what it is they accept their government doing.
He called it a
practical consensus.
His own experience in foreign affairs limited, Obama surrounded himself with hawkish advisors, among them Bush holdover Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, a hardliner from the Bill Casey CIA era of the 80s. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was equally hawkish. In an early speech, Clinton presented a version of American history steeped in unvarnished triumphalism and historical amnesia.
So let me say it clearly. The United States can, must, and will lead in this new century. The Third World War that so many feared never came. And many millions of people were lifted out of poverty and exercised their human rights for the first time. Those were the benefits of a global architecture forged over many years by American leaders from both political parties.
It would be difficult to find and ask the millions killed over many decades of American interference in their countries what they thought. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Philippines, Central America, Greece, Iran, Brazil, Cuba, Congo, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Chile, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan, among others. In Afghanistan, Obama, calling it a war of necessity, doubled down on Bush. Pressured in late 2009 into sending more troops, he wavered. He was told by a military advisor, "I don't see how you can defy your military chain here," meaning that his high command might resign in protest. CIA Director Leon Panetta told him, "No Democratic president can go against military advice, especially if he asks for it. So just do it," he recommended. Do what they say. When it came down to his decision, Obama did not show the courage of a John Kennedy. In December, he announced another 30,000 troop increase to reach almost 100,000, about the same number the Soviets had deployed in their disastrous invasion of Afghanistan. He announced the troop increase at West Point, reminding the cadets that the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan because it had provided sanctuary for al-Qaeda. But he neglected to mention that most of the preparations for 9/11 took place not in Afghanistan, but in apartments in Germany and Spain and flight schools in the U.S. Or that only 50 to 100 of al-Qaeda's 300 cadre were actually left in Afghanistan, and that most were now in Pakistan, an ally. That the president waging two wars would receive the Nobel Peace Prize that same month was surreal in the first place. But when the world heard Obama's defense of American unilateralism and preemption, the meaning of the prize had been diminished, as it had by Kissinger 36 years earlier.
I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war. That is what makes us different from those whom we fight.
Obama feared getting bogged down in Afghanistan as Johnson had in Vietnam. What the backward, dirt-poor, overwhelmingly illiterate Afghans needed was economic aid, education, and social reform. The U.S. spent $110 billion on military programs in 2011, but only $2 billion for sustainable development. With big U.S. money floating around as in Vietnam, corruption reached epic proportions. Mistrust between the supposed NATO and Afghan allies soared. The U.S.-backed President Hamid Karzai announced that he would support Pakistan if it should go to war with the U.S. By 2012, Afghan soldiers and police were killing U.S. troops with such increasing regularity that the forces had to be increasingly separated. Meanwhile, bedraggled, demoralized U.S. forces left Iraq in December 2011. Almost 4,500 U.S. troops would not come home. More than 32,000 wounded, many of them severely. Iraqi death counts ranged from 150,000 to over 1 million. 2 million Iraqis fled the country. The irony was exquisite. In deposing the Sunni Hussein, the United States had turned the new Shiite-dominated Iraq into a valuable ally of Iran, which ended up the war's biggest winner. Bush officials had estimated the Iraq war to cost $50 to $60 billion. Rumsfeld had called anything above $100 billion baloney. By 2008, when Bush left office, the U.S. had spent some $700 billion on the war, not including long-term care for veterans. Economists project total long-term costs as high as $3 trillion. Obama welcomed the troops home at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, ensuring that the end of the war would be as dishonest as its beginning.
but we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. Unlike the old empires, we don't make these sacrifices for territory or for resources. We do it because it's right. Never forget that you are part of an unbroken line of heroes spanning 2 centuries. To your grandparents and parents who faced down fascism and communism and delivered justice to those who attacked us on 9/11.
Thus sanctioning once again Bush's lie about the connection of 9/11 to Iraq. The words were barely out of his mouth before Iraq was racked with a new series of deadly suicide bombings. To this day, Iraq teeters on the edge of
So we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have questions answered, asked and answered, and we have to be out of here within the next 20 minutes, I believe. So, and there's a book signing afterwards, immediately afterwards. So I just want to take the opportunity of thanking Oliver and Peter. And I'd like to now turn it over to Donna, and I think that there are questions already.
Now we get a chance to open up the dialogue with you. So I'm incorporating as many questions as I have from your cards. So I'm going to take them several at a time. Okay, the first set of questions. What do your peers in Hollywood think? What is it like to evolve the way you have as a major director? Second question, you were introduced as a Jeffersonian Democrat. What economists and philosophers have you been influenced by or are in agreement with?
The second question on the Hollywood, what was the...
They were basically asking, how are your peers responding to your recent work? And also, can you talk about your evolution as a director?
Yeah, briefly, you know, politics don't make good bedfellows with Hollywood. They're very hard to make political movies. Most of the political movies have been to the right, frankly. The Rambo series is very successful, as was the Chuck Norris Missing in Action. A lot of the Zero Dark 30 is, again, very supportive of our policy and of vigilantism. And I mean, even Argo gives a very, a thrilling movie, gives a very pro-American point of view about Iran and doesn't really tell us the background. So, you know, that's what you're facing. There are some occasionally, I think, progressive movies that get through, like Syriana, I thought was interesting and very different, but it wasn't a big moneymaker. So it's very hard to get this made. All these movies. I could not probably make JFK today or Nixon, not even close. I got Bush was financed, the W movie was financed, 55% of that money came from Hong Kong. So nobody was interested in this country. We're not, Hollywood dissuades you from doing it. The most liberal section, the liberal era in Hollywood filmmaking was the 1930s and early 40s, when all these communists were working. And the guy who wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Sidney Buckman, was a communist member of the party, and a lot of them were blacklisted and graylisted, and you know the story. So the most liberal period is gone, and I think the 80s were a disaster. Platoon was sort of and Born on the Fourth started to go the other way. But by the 1990s, when Bush Sr. got in office, we had the whole rap about the greatest generation, World War II generation, neglecting, of course, the fact that a lot of that generation had been pro-Nazi and fascist, did not want involvement in Spain, were willing, our businesses, our corporations were doing business with Nazi Germany up to 1941, some beyond. Profits from many of those companies, Ford, GM, were repatriated after the war. We always had a very strong German, America has always had a strong fascist leaning. And it came back in. We took all the German scientists we could, and we took all the spy agency. We took this monster Gehlen, who into our embrace. Angleton and Dulles and all those scumbags brought them in, and basically, you know, started an anti-Soviet, the old anti-Soviet propaganda machine recycled right after World War II, right away. So the films have not reflected that, frankly, and will never. I don't know how to get around it. Money means you have to make people happy, and you have to have a good... The problem with history, in American history, and I'm going to quickly get to a point, is that the kids don't like it, and they don't really care about it because it's so sanitized like a Disney movie. They take all the horror, juicy horror stuff out of history in school, and you don't get this kind of history, and the kids get bored because they know it's bullshit. American triumphalism. And it's American triumphalism in the movies, it's in the history books, it's all around us, it permeates our culture, it permeates the evening news. It's sad. It's sad that we're living in this warped vision of the world. It's a bubble. But I can't do much business there if I talk like that and do like that. But I have to get my message out this way. This movie was not really been seen. It's a premium cable. Some people really like it, and I have to say some very big people, wonderful people, really appreciate it. But it's not really known yet, and I hope the DVD in October will get more and more adherence to it, because Peter and I are out to make this a 10, 20-year journey, hopefully to get it into schools. We're trying in California.
I was just going to follow that up quickly by saying, for those of us that work in the universities, the university can be a wonderful site for public screenings and also having your local library order documentaries, which I do as often as I can. Okay.
Long live Rutgers. It's a good university.
Go Rutgers. We're fighting the good fight there.
He was a Rutgers graduate.
Scarlet Knights. Growing up as an American Indian in the Dinah Nation, I was very skeptical of American history, much as you said earlier. In your research and background for this series and films, what was the most intriguing or enlightening part of American history that you learned that you didn't know before? How did your early experience as a journalist influence your later dramatic work? And what advice do you have for young journalists and filmmakers seeking to find a broader audience for their work in fiction film? And finally, were you influenced by Howard Zinn?
I was, yes. I got to know him a bit in his later years, and I was very much admired him. And his work is seminal. Of course, he was supportive of our project, but he unfortunately never saw it to its completion. As to my influences, as I gave you with the earlier version of my life, my influence, my father, conservatism. I thought Castro was a devil. I thought everything, you know, my life evolved. So, I mean, it's been gradual. It's talking to people like Peter, talking to so many people in my life have helped me to evolve my thinking. As to being a filmmaker, the best way to do it is to tell a story, tell it well, make it exciting. You can take a story about the most boring subject in the world, and believe me, there could be nothing more boring at one point than Nixon. And you can, well, I mean, on the surface anyway, and dig deep and get the roots and make it exciting. That's the beauty of, but learn how to be a storyteller. You can take any experience and make it exciting, any experience.
What is your vision for this country and the world, and how are we going to get there? There are two more. In what way would you encourage people to use this to organize politically? And finally, in your opinion, which political leader or figure of this generation will be revered in the future? Who will be featured in documentaries years from now, and why?
Someone in the audience, perhaps, will be watching this and will say, you know, I'm always trying to get to that next generation. I made this for my children. My daughter didn't even watch it. But we'll see about that. I think that the next leaders are out there. I always believe the curve of the ball can break differently. And I think the protests are very important. Grassroots movements, crucial. They had a huge influence. Although they were ignored and somewhat in the 1950s when the anti-nuclear movements were seen as minorities, but by the 1960s when they took to the streets, after Madison, Wisconsin, and all that anger built up. Johnson and Nixon were convinced, as was Hoover, that this was communist-inspired. As we know, it was not. But basically, that movement drove Lyndon Johnson from office, and it also made Nixon at least put a pause button up, because he did have far wickeder plans for bombing the North and the South than he actually executed. But they were, and he also took the nuclear threat to Vietnam more than once. So those protests really moved Nixon, that he wanted to be reelected. Unfortunately, he was reelected in '72, like Bush was in 2004, and that's what depresses us about the American experience, because we see it in front of our eyes, but we somehow end up supporting the madmen. So it's a shame, because George McGovern would have been a great candidate, as well as John Kerry and Al Gore could have been great presidents, or better presidents. But listen, you gotta in politics, you gotta be practical. Peter, you want to add?
Well, Oliver said that George Bush was reelected in 2004. We know that that's not technically true. I mean, in terms of our vision and how this is going to be used, we see this as a tool for the movement. We saw this as providing the historical background for the Occupy movement. A lot of young activists, I've found, have little sense of history. And they don't understand the importance of history. They don't understand that each person is guided by his or her own understanding of history. That what people do when they act is based upon a certain view of history and a view of the past. And what we believe is that the constraints, the narrowness of one's view of history limit what one can think about in terms of future alternatives. So if people realize how close the United States has come to fundamentally different historical outcomes in the past, they might understand that the future could be fundamentally different also. Most people, the problem is, compared to the 1960s, there's very little sense of utopianism out there. There's very little belief that the world could be fundamentally different than it is. And we got to be practical, and you have to also have a vision. You have to also have a sense of humanity. You also have the sense that the world, that people can relate to each other in fundamentally different ways than we're doing now. That we can share this planet and have a sense of what global warming means as we're slowly killing ourselves and killing future generations. That our people are capable of that kind of understanding and vision. And if they can see that in the past and have a different understanding of history, we're hoping that they'll be able to use that to create a very different future.
And I would like to add simply that desperation is also a factor here, because if you have the gap between rich and poor so large as it is in the U.S. and the treatment of labor this way, it will reach a point like the French Revolution, and people will have enough. So. Another observation of mine from becoming a mini historian these last 5-6 years has been, it's just never goes the way you think it's going to go. In 1941, Nazi Germany was impregnable. They were taking over the world. No one could stop them. It was profound arrogance. When we went into Vietnam, it was with profound World War II generation arrogance. We'd won World War II. How could we be defeated by a, quoting Kissinger, a fourth-rate power? They defeated us with their spirit. We bombed the shit out of them. We killed them. 3.8 million of them died. Everyone knows the Holocaust figures were 6 million, but very few Americans know that 3.8 million Vietnamese died. They took it. They took enormous punishment, and they beat us with their spirit. So maybe I'm just a movie maker, but I still believe in that Frank Capra thing where the spirit will win, and we will somehow overcome this arrogance, this hubristic empire that we have now that seems impregnable. We now have the force with space weaponry to actually control, tyrannize the planet just like Darth Vader did. By 2025, we're going to have drones up at 250 miles in space, be able to pinpoint targets in China, Russia, Venezuela, wherever, and kill or incapacitate or cyberspace to death, or destroy their navigational abilities.
So we will be, if we have that ability militarily, who can stop us? We will be the empire, and no empire has ever lasted in history, ever. The German Empire didn't last, and I'm sure the American Empire won't last.
Donna, let me just go on a little bit more what Oliver was saying, because the point is so important that you don't know what's going to happen at any moment. Who would have predicted that a 26-year-old street vendor killing himself in Tunisia would have triggered Arab Spring? Nobody would have guessed that. Who would have guessed that what's happening in Turkey now would have happened a few weeks ago? Nobody saw this coming. We had some idea of it because we were told about the responses that we're getting there. We knew that there's the undercurrent there of this kind of protest and anger. But Oliver was saying this arrogance that Americans have. Let me tell one story about Larry Heineman, who was a Vietnam vet, who wrote a novel called Paco's Story, which won the National Book Award in 1990. He went to a meeting in which he met a Professor Lien, who taught American literature at Hanoi University. And so he asked Professor Lien, what did you do during the war? And he said, well, first I went to Beijing to learn English. Then I went to Moscow University to study American literature. Then I went back to Hanoi, and then they sent me out to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where I worked with the soldiers there, and I taught them American literature. And I taught them about Whitman, and about Hemingway, and Faulkner, and Fitzgerald, and Jack London. And he said that the Vietnamese soldiers carried translations of American literature in their packs while they were fighting during the war. And then he turned to Larry Heineman, and he said, and what Vietnamese literature did you soldiers read during the war? And Larry Heineman says, I laughed so hard that the beer started to squirt out my nose. You know, so it's that kind of attitude. The Americans, this colossal ignorance of the world, and this kind of conceit and arrogance that's behind so much of these policies. But we don't know the effects of all these things that we're doing, that Michael Moore, that other people are doing, that the organizers are doing, the Occupy movement. This country could be a lot closer to exploding in a good way than we might realize.
We're running out of time, so this is our final set of questions. You have many, many fans in the audience who are anticipating both the DVD release and your next project. So this is a genre that there are many questions like this, asking if you might consider making a film on these themes. What about making a film about the extinction of the many species on Earth? Can you conceive of creating a new film about private commercial banks, how they create money and decide who gets this money, like speculators, producers of weapons, and lobbyists? And finally, would you consider doing a film on WikiLeaks and whistleblowers? And to this I would add, what kinds of projects are you envisioning?
I don't tell. This lovely lady gave me these cards outside. There's about austerity, tar sands, Goldman Sachs, corporate personhood, healthcare, the military-industrial, the monetary system, NDAA, Monsanto, the prison industries complex, climate change, Wells Fargo, drone attacks, student debt, fracking, ALEC, A-L-E-C, Republicans in the White House, Walmart. You have to understand, I get this all the time. I mean, these are documentaries. You know, one thing I can vow to you is I will not do another documentary right now, because I've got to make a feature, and I want to make it juicy and fun and exciting, and I hope you all come.
Again, we'd like to thank Oliver Stone, Peter Kuznick, and Bill Fletcher for this incredible evening.
Thank you very much.
Great theater. Yeah.